6 Tudor Queens. Jane Seymour, The Haunted Queen, Part 3. Today I want to talk about the third book in the series, 6 Tudor Queens, Jane Seymour, The Haunted Queen by Alison Weir. This video has been broken into 3 parts because it is so long. This is the final part of the Jane Seymour series. This video will be the third in a series covering Alison Weir's 6 Tudor Queens novels and her other works of historical fiction. I love Alison Weir as a historian, but also as a historical fiction writer. In the previous 2 videos, we covered Jane's early life and family dramas. We've seen her come to court to serve Queen Catherine, and we've seen her loyalty for Queen Catherine grow and her hatred of Anne Boleyn grow, even as she was forced to serve her. We also see Jane agonize over her lack of male attention, but then finally Jane has a male admirer, and it is the king. We see Jane slowly fall in love with Henry, and we see how her true affection for him shines through as she listens to him and acts with little personal motive for gain. While Jane is busy falling in love for the first time, Thomas Cromwell is busy cooking up a plot to get rid of Anne Boleyn. Jane doesn't want Anne hurt, but is very happy when Henry asks her to marry him, because she is now pregnant, so he sends her to the country to wait out Anne's trial and execution, and that is where we pick up with Jane in this video. Out in the countryside, Jane is still feeling bad about Anne's fate, and missing Henry terribly. Her mood lightens slightly when her parents arrive, and she gets to tell them the happy news about her betrothal to the king. But her father looks sick, and she is very worried about him. They soon move to Chelsea at Henry's request, and Jane is happy to be nearer to him, but she is still worrying about Anne's fate, and when she realizes many of the common people think she is a whore reveling in Anne's downfall, she is very hurt by it. The fact Jane is pregnant at this time makes her feel it even more acutely, and when her mother figures out she is pregnant, Jane cries. Lady Seymour is very understanding though, telling Jane everything is okay and that she will soon be married, but Jane is still sad the baby was conceived outside wedlock. Henry comes to visit Jane on 2 occasions, and both times gets very drunk, ranting loudly about Anne. This is the only time in the 6 Tudor Queens books so far that we get to see Henry really drunk, and I feel it is a testament to how upset he is over what he thinks is Anne's betrayal. The day Anne is beheaded, Jane is picking out silks for her wedding dress, and she can't help but feel it is wrong somehow. This is the happiest moment of Jane's life, but it has been bought at the expense of somebody's actual life. I think this is a very good portrayal of human emotion, especially mixed emotion. A few days after Anne's execution, Jane and Henry are married, and Jane pushes all thoughts of Anne to the side and enjoys the day. But she is very upset that Henry will not consummate their marriage, because he is worried about hurting the baby. Jane never expected to spend her wedding night being as chaste as a virgin. Jane is very aware of her new rank, and resolves to put a distance between herself and her former friends and the maiden's daughter. Jane's actions come across all wrong though, and she appears cold and unapproachable, and she is very upset by this because she has hurt her friends. Especially Marjorie Horseman, who is visibly upset at the Queen's coldness, as they were besties. This necessary severing of close friendships is one of the reasons I empathize with Jane's character. Have we all not experienced something similar? Even if it is just a simple moving apart. Then, only a few days after her wedding, after a day in the saddle, Jane loses the baby she is carrying. When her pains begin, she sees a shadow on the wall of a woman wearing a French hood, and it scares her, but Jane puts it to one side, thinking it is only a dream. Jane is deeply saddened by the loss of the baby, but resolved there will be more children, and the loss of the baby has convinced her to speak out for the Lady Mary, who the king is still very angry with for refusing to acknowledge him as the head of the church and her mother's marriage as unlawful. Jane brings up the subject of the Lady Mary in bed after sex with Henry, thinking he will be in a good mood and more likely to agree and forgive her. But he gets very angry, and Jane ends up getting herself raped for her trouble. She cries herself to sleep, and realizes this is a part of Henry she has never seen before. He can be cruel, and Jane realizes she hates this part of Henry's personality. But in true Jane Seymour style, she puts it behind her and decides to be positive because there are many other aspects of Henry she loves. The rape scene was disturbing and unexpected. This is the first time in this book series, actually the only time, that you see Henry be sexually violent towards a woman. I know Anne Boleyn in the second book claims Henry raped her, but I think Mary is a slightly unreliable witness, especially because later on she is then very jealous of her sister Anne. I think Henry's change in behaviour is directly linked to how hurt he felt by Anne Boleyn's alleged infidelity. The Lady Mary finally capitulates, but not without everyone worrying Henry will have her executed, and Chapuis having to assure her God will forgive her for giving in. When Henry and Jane visit the Lady Mary, Jane is shocked by how sick and thin Mary appears. I am not surprised. The sort of stress the Lady Mary was under would be hard for a grown-up to bear, never mind a teenager. The Lady Mary is pathetically grateful that Jane is being kind to her, and Jane feels true sympathy for the girl, and she knows Henry is now feeling bad for how horribly he behaved towards her because he knows Mary has been truly unwell. They also visit the Lady Elizabeth, and Jane likes the smart little girl, but is distressed to discover Mary does not believe Elizabeth to be the king's child, even though she is the image of him. Jane thinks Mary is a little deranged for believing such a thing, especially when the king does not. I think this is very good foreshadowing for Mary's behaviour in other Alison Weir novels like The Lady Elizabeth and Innocent Traitor. I would really like Alison Weir to do a Mary Tudor book. She could call it something like The First Queen of England or Tudor Rose. I don't know, I just think a Mary Tudor book would be really good, as we never really get her perspective overly much. And I believe she is overly demonized. Not that she was overly nice, but perspective is everything. Jane attends a dinner hosted by her brother Edward and is unsettled by something Thomas Cromwell says, which is that he thought up the charges against Anne Boleyn. Jane is completely horrified by the idea that Anne was innocent and murdered on Jane's account. Jane goes back to Millefleur, the tower where she saw Anne and Norris, and feels a great sense of despair and hopelessness, and decides it is Anne and Norris's feelings about their hopeless love and bloody fate. I am not always a fan of magic or supernatural in books about historical fiction, but Alison Weir walks the line between reality and disbelief very well. Jane decides she can never truly trust Cromwell, and if he got rid of Anne, he could get rid of her. Jane decides to keep Cromwell sweet, because he is dangerous, a sensible move from a wise woman. People tend to overlook Jane as being one of the least political of Henry's queens, but I think she was very politically savvy and played it safe, a sensible move from a woman who had learnt from her predecessors. Then the Margaret Douglas Edward Howard affair comes out, and Jane thinks Henry is ridiculously angry and overly cruel to the two lovebirds, which he is, but Jane comes to understand his anger is deeply rooted in his fears for this succession. Then Henry is grief-stricken by the death of his 16-year-old bastard son Henry Fitzroy, and all his fears for the succession seem manifold. His only possible heir as he sees it is Margaret Douglas, and in his words, she is the naughty girl in the tower. Jane can see how deeply upset Henry is, and she is upset because she is not conceived again, and that is the only true remedy to Henry's happiness. Jane is aware that Henry is wallowing in self-pity and overeating and gaining weight, and his leg ulcer is not healing. She decides to be forward and make him come to bed to conceive an heir, and that lifts his spirits because they are successful. They are both very happy about the new pregnancy, but there is an uprising in the north that quickly develops into the Pilgrimage of Grace. Jane is terrified of the rebels, even though she agrees with their views. She is convinced by Ambassador Chapuis to appeal to Henry publicly to reinstate the monasteries, and it is the worst possible move. Henry gives her a public dressing down, telling her to remember what happened to Anne Boleyn, and not to meddle in his affairs of state. Jane is heartbroken, but Henry apologizes privately and tells her to stay out of politics, and she agrees, seeing it as a sensible move. Christmas is fast approaching, and the Lady Mary is received back at court for the first time. She is obviously very nervous and faints at the meeting. Jane marvels at the fact that Henry cannot see that his daughter's nerve problems are his own fault, not the dead Anne Boleyn's. Jane knows a husband and children would make Mary much happier, but Henry is adamant that he will only let Mary marry once he has a male heir, and Mary is convinced that nobody will want her due to her bastard status when Jane broaches the subject with her. I think Jane empathizes with Mary here because for a long time Jane felt unwanted by men and blamed her looks, whereas Mary now blames her new status as a bastard. Henry is very excited about Jane's new pregnancy and points it out publicly at a feast. But then Jane miscarries, and again, right before her pains begin, Jane sees the shadow of a woman wearing a French hood on the wall and thinks it looks even more like Anne Boleyn. She scares herself into thinking Anne has come to take away her son. Jane and Henry are both very upset by the miscarriage, and Henry is wondering yet again why he cannot seem to have any male children. The rebels are still advancing and have taken York. Unable to muster a big enough force of an army, Henry decides to dissemble and invites the rebel leader Robert Aske to court. Jane likes Robert Aske and agrees with many of his principles privately, but Jane doesn't like the way Henry is behaving with Aske. She thinks her husband can be very two-faced and knows from her last appeal not to question Henry's political decisions. Henry and Jane have a lovely Christmas, with both the Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth at court, and Jane becomes pregnant again. Henry goes into overdrive trying to keep Jane and the pregnancy safe. Jane is living in fear of the shadow of Anne appearing on her bedroom wall. During this time, Jane agrees to her sister Lizzie marrying Cromwell's heir Gregory. She is worried about losing this baby and scared of Cromwell, and she wants him tied to her by marriage because she remembers the downfall of Anne Boleyn all too clearly. Henry keeps all rebellion news away from Jane, and she finds out through court gossip that Robert Aske has been hanged in chains for treason, and she is deeply upset by this news because she thought he was a good man. Then, as Jane's pregnancy advances, Jane's father, Sir John, dies, and Jane is unable to attend his funeral because she is queen, which is very upsetting. I feel very sorry for Jane here because the court does not even wear mourning for her father. Then Jane goes into confinement, and though her labour is long, she is successfully delivered of a prince. The most touching thing about this whole scene is that Jane asks Henry to stay with her after the baby's birth, and they all fall asleep together in the same bed. It is so cute and lovely, it makes what is about to happen all the sadder. Jane feels well and is annoyed the midwife will only let her eat broth. Hungry for something more substantial, she orders food from the kitchen, and then writes letters proclaiming the birth of her son, feeling very happy with herself, as she should. She has managed to do something not even a princess of Spain could do. Jane is unbelievably proud when her son is christened, and her and Henry are fully united in their joy. Then Jane starts getting stomach pains and becomes violently ill, and she thinks she has food poisoning, but her hands and feet are tingling. It seems to pass, but then comes back more violently, and she is now finding it painful to breathe. The king is very worried and summons his own doctors, but Jane realizes with horror they do not know what is wrong with her. Breathing is becoming harder and harder, and then Jane sees that shadow on the wall, and it is unmistakably Anne Boleyn beckoning to her, and Jane knows she will die. It has also become obvious to everyone else that Jane is dying, and Henry is in floods of tears, cursing himself for not being able to save her. The Lady Mary is there too, crying, and so is Cromwell. But Jane feels like she is in a dream and cannot focus on anyone. Her last words are to see her son to bless him, but when they finally bring the boy to her, she does not have the strength to speak. So she blesses him in her heart and hopes that blessing will last an entire lifetime. And she tries to focus on his sweet face as she slips away. Every time I read this last line, I want to cry. It is so beautiful and painful and just sad. I give this book 10 out of 10. It is beautifully written and gives a character to the most forgotten of Henry's queens. This is the end of the Jane Seymour, The Haunted Queen book review. If you enjoyed this book review, please like, comment and subscribe so you will not miss the next book in this series, which is Anna of Cliffa, Queen of Secrets, which will be with you very soon. You can also follow me on Instagram at Lady Jessica Riddell. Until next time, remember we are all bound to obey and serve.